Welcome aboard the Shipshape podcast, your ultimate destination for marine wisdom and expertise. Our skilled crew, comprised of top boating journalists and experts, is committed to delivering informative and captivating content week after week. We're eager to connect with and learn from our fellow mariners, and we encourage you to share our podcast with your friends. Remember, word of mouth is our lifeblood, and if you enjoy an episode, please leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. By doing so, you're helping us forge a robust community of mariners who can learn, collaborate, and exchange their experiences out on the water.
Today on the Shipshape podcast, we're diving deep into history with a renowned maritime, aviation, and military historian, Eric Wiberg. With over 45 nonfiction books to his credit and decades of research under his belt, Eric's work uncovers fascinating narratives from the past with a keen eye for details others might overlook. Among his many exciting endeavors, today we focus on his expeditions in the Bahamas, where he's uncovered 10 World War II aircraft wrecks. These discoveries aren't just historical treasures, but they've also been recognized by institutions like the U.S. Congress to honor World War II veterans. So sit tight as we sail on a journey back in time with Eric, exploring the mysteries of the deep, the tales of lost World War II planes, and the captivating stories they hold. Your two co-hosts today are Meryl Shred. I'm a live aboard on a Toshing Toshiba 36 in Boston, Massachusetts, and Farah.
Thanks, Meryl. Yes, my name is Farah, and I'm doing the Shipshape podcast with Meryl. We've been doing this for quite a while, and we're very happy to have Eric once again. Hi, Eric.
Hi, Farah. Hi, Meryl. Thanks for having me.
So, Eric, where are you recording this from?
I'm in the original clubhouse, Meryl, for the New York Yacht Club, of which I'm a member, and it's in Newport. It's very busy Thursday afternoon, which a club should be. 100 yachts just sailed on the annual cruise, and they have a lot of international regattas. And the rooms I would normally use are occupied by staff meetings or arguments about etiquette and rules. You know, they're like committee meetings for. So I'm in the original clubhouse, so I'm very fortunate. There's going to be a wedding here in about 2 hours, so I'm very lucky.
It looks beautiful. I mean, I'm looking at the roof and I'm looking at all the lovely flags, and the weather must be amazing as well.
It is. In fact, I have with me a very important piece of equipment for my research, and that is a swim trunk. And as soon as this ends, I'll be in the ocean, the North Atlantic.
Sounds like the life to live.
Yeah.
So we've interviewed you in the past and we got your kind of grand overarching story. But this episode, we're going to focus on kind of one of the things that you do, which is going out and searching for World War II planes. And so let me begin by asking, where did this interest in discovering these World War II wrecks in the Bahamas come from?
A good question, Meryl. And there's two prongs. One is our family for 3 generations have been consular corps members, diplomats, ambassadors, basically in the Bahamas. That means finding people other people have lost or who aren't so important to other people anymore. For example, they've gotten involved in the drug trade, they've done something illegal, they've ended up in prison, they're missing, they're flying planes illegally, and they go missing. So that's number one. I've represented some in court. I have to be careful what I say. I brought cigarettes to them in Her Majesty's Prison, Fox Hill, Nassau, which we drove past every day. And I'm aware of the hardships some of them suffered. I found some of their yachts wrecked. I've gone through the detritus, the photos, the diaries, and the equipment that's left from said yacht. Some have been suicides, by drink, quite a bit of drama. And a couple have assaulted. When my dad has rescued Swedes from abusive relationships, he's been assaulted at our house. So it's been an immediate tactile experience of helping strangers. That's the simple message. The second prong is much more immediate. November 21, our mother was very ill, and it was a prolonged death from cancer, and I couldn't stand to hear it all day. So after doing my mornings, I would go swim for a couple hours looking for this lost plane, and then I'd come home, check in, borrow her car, and then go back in the afternoon. So it became up to 5 hours a day of swimming, and that was in November, and she passed in December 2021. I did find the plane, And I know that helped me bring closure, and it helped me feel I did something good. And then we have a tennis court because my mom's a tennis professional. So we put out all the parts, 45 parts of an airplane. I laid it out on our tennis court and my dad protected it. So it gave him something to distract him from his wife of 50 plus years demise, that he could help me, and that he saw the Germans go through war, Sweden. So those are the two answers. My dad is a consular, my brother's a consular corps, my sister-in-law, my brother-in-law who represents Sweden and Bahamas, his uncle is an ambassador, the fellow Blix who said the United Nations there was no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, his mother is a Wiberg. So we have a mission to help strangers in our country reconnect. I also found a dead Norwegian on the beach from World War II and on live television, and sort of connected him with his family and with Norway's place in the world puzzle of World War II.
Can you tell us a bit about the historical context of why these planes are in the Bahamas?
That is, again, very important a question. It's also much more simple than we would think. The reason we don't know about it is until 1972, all records were illegal. They were censored until 1972. And even the Bahamas, Bermuda, all these places had severe censorship. That was one of the few female demographics. You had censors were largely female, nurses, nuns, so forth and so forth. And so we couldn't know the story. The story is very simple. Without being bombed, North America could produce a ton of airplanes, hundreds of thousands. Without being bombed, Royal Air Force people from all over the world, South Africa, New Zealand, Rhodesia, India, Australia, all over the world, Poland, Czech Republic, Jews from Czechoslovakia were trained in the Bahamas. So they had a training base in the Bahamas because aside from U-boats, which there were 113 patrols, there was little fear of being attacked. And in fact, no RAF plane was sunk by a U-boat in the Bahamas in World War II. So Bahamas were British. They occupy a huge area between Florida and Cuba, about 100,000 square miles. And it was an ideal place for pilots to train. And mostly, if you wrecked, you would land in the ocean. So the survivability rate was supposed to be higher. And it was friendly territory. And here's the very important thing, a couple of statistics. The headquarters, and I kid you not, the headquarters for all southern route transatlantic delivery of aircraft from North America to Europe via West Africa. So here's the route. You build your plane, say, in Iowa. You move it to Chicago. British take it down to Nassau, Bahamas. Then they go to Boroquén, Puerto Rico, Trinidad, Belém, Brazil, Ascension Island in the middle of the Atlantic, and then normally Dakar, West Africa. From there, they go to Khartoum or Durban, or they go north up to Cairo, or even to Marrakesh, whichever. But from there, they go where they will, including to Burma, Myanmar, the Hump, really important places, right, to win the war. And a lot of the medium bombers, I won't bore you with the detail, they go into, like, say, from Cairo, they could hit, the pesky oil fields, which they did twice over Crete, despite the fall. So it was really, really important. Now, why couldn't they go north to Europe? Because RAF presence, U-boat presence, horrible weather, especially during World War II, they actually had worse weather than normal, and large distances and just a high failure rate. So they thought it would be better to go to Nassau. So typically the paperwork was done in Nassau, and that was the reason number one. The headquarters of all Allied aircraft getting to Europe was Nassau, Bahamas. That was where the British took them over from the Americans, because Canada was, I think, basically British. So you see, the second thing is the British trained over 8,000 officers and pilots and other important roles, but 7,000 or 8,000, right? People were trained on fighting Nazis in the Bahamas. And that is why you had a high number of deaths and a high number of crashes. The aircraft for the training base weren't very new. They weren't all factory planes. They actually were workhorses that took off and landed every day. Some of them were new, of course, but most of them were workhorses that were there for years, right? But the men, as soon as they passed their training unit, it was called Operation Training Unit 111, they immediately went to the front to fight and die. So that's why they took so many risks, because they tried to make it as action-like as possible. Not so much fighters, although there were a lot of de Havilland Mosquitoes. It was mostly bombers. That's two components. You're training 7,000 to 8,000 people who took 25% of the population of Bahamas. Then you were transport. There was Wing Transport 113. They had 9,000 aircraft. Think about that, 9,000 aircraft that went from the Bahamas to Africa or tried. In Bahamas alone, 170 crashed, some of them minor, and some of them catastrophic. I think there's 165 to 70, and then people who died. And then there's one other very important factor. The United States, what became the Air Force, was then the United States Army Air Force, AAF. They did a ton of transport of their own, looking after their own bases, going down to Brazil, to Trinidad, to West Africa. They had a Patton and all those guys. Boxing them on ships was a huge pain for a number of reasons. Reassembly and loss during shipment. Thousands of airplanes were lost just on the way to Cape Town on ships, right? So it was just faster and easier. So what the Americans would do, they'd get 10 planes, they'd leave Miami, they'd fly to Africa. They would then reconvene. They would smuggle booze from the Bahamas, whiskey, and they'd fill the nose plane with cases of whiskey. They'd sell it a huge profit in Ascension. There was a guy on the tarmac with thousands of dollars cash in the 40s to pay them. When they would then go to West Africa, they would reassemble and play cards and smoke. Remember, these are daredevil kind of guys, and they would be smuggling bales of rubber. Imagine this, bales of rubber, apparently it stinks like hell. So the aircraft is filled with this nauseous rubber, and guys were fainting and passing out because this nasty smell of like raw rubber, right? And they're trying to smoke and play. So 10 guys would then board a plane piloted by one guy who would take them back to New York, and then they'd go to Toronto and Chicago and Ohio. They dragged a guy out of bed 3 times with pneumonia. And when he crashed, he could hardly crawl. I mean, they were so desperate for pilots. They were pulling Eastern Airlines pilots, Pan American pilots. They were pulling Pan Am planes. If you were a Pan Am Eastern plane pilot, you had to report U-boat sightings. You had to report anything. So the mixture, if you get it, between civilian and military was very opaque. Everyone was forced into work.
Could you tell our listeners why the rubber? I'm fascinated.
They were just making money. They're just making money. So you're in West Africa. I mean, it's like drug smuggling, like, oh yeah, like you get cocoa. Rubber was very, very valuable because Malaysia had fallen to the Japanese, right? So Germans were stealing inner tubes and tires off trucks. Rubber was hugely valuable. Rubber was in such poor supply that they would actually I forget, it's boggling. From the factory, they would fly a plane to a place they had wheels and strip the rubber off and then fly that plane with rubber back. And they were so short of rubber that it affected the supply chain significantly to the effect they would take the rubber off planes, lay them up for a week, fly them back, that's how valuable rubber was. So these guys were making some bucks on the side, right? And who's going to begrudge them? Because 1 out of 10 of them drop out of the sky every flight. But here's another interesting fact. Some of these airplanes and boats were destined to the Soviet Union. And they actually had Soviet Union markings on them. And they would crash with CCCP on the side because they were on their way to Russia, right? Or Soviet Union. So just crazy stuff. They had boats designated for the Soviets. I mean, so you can just imagine, it's just mind-boggling. And then true to the military, right? They're like, you read these details. And where were you going, sir? I cannot disclose that. Because he's going to Myanmar, he's going to fight with the communists in China, he's going to fight with communists. I'm sorry, I can't discuss where I was going. You're not important enough. I was in a cafe in Marion, Massachusetts about 3 months ago in the winter, and I couldn't find this damn plane because it crashed near my brother's boarding school. And I went to the cafe. I'm like, somebody in this Marion knows where the hell the plane is. And the waitress, the poor thing, she's 17. She goes, Mr. Smith over there, he flew a lot in the U.S. military. He knows a lot. He's a pilot. I hear him talking about airplanes all the time. So 3 old white guys, right? So I go up. I'm like, hey, gentlemen, I understand, Mr. Smith, that you're a pilot. He goes, I am. And I go, I understand, that you were in the military. He goes, of a sort.
Of a sort. CIA. Nice.
Of a sort. So he's like, who told you that? I was like, the 17-year-old over there. Anyway, so there's a lot of layers. I'm looking at a plane. The guy who invented the fingerprint for criminal use was being flown a couple miles from here to Nantucket on D-Day, probably, and that technology is still in use today. He was a Stanford professor, probably to nail the Nazis that were war crimes. So on the day of D-Day, they were flying this guy to Europe. It was a very secret mission. probably to start nailing captives, right? But he crashed right here in Jamestown in 12 feet of water, 200 feet from the shore. So I'm still looking for that airplane, but nobody in the village knew about it because it's secret. So I'm sorry. There are a lot of layers to it, but the simple truth is that thousands and thousands of airplanes flew over the Bahamas, basically because you had no damn choice. If you want to go from America to Africa, you got to fly over the Bahamas. So when they flew over the Bahamas, they used to crash near lighthouses. And we forget people have their own minds, right? These aren't just machines falling out of the sky. The pilots would aim for the base of the lighthouse so that somebody would find them, even if they die. It's like on Coney Island, a guy was aiming for the beach to save his sorry little ass, like the fighter pilot guys. And they realized, God damn it, it's filled with kids. I can't do it. Now, someone before him had done so and plowed into the kids. That wasn't very friendly. So he averted it at the last minute and landed on the ocean right in front of Coney Island. Do you know what happened next? The fathers swam to save him. The fathers knew that he had saved their families. And so they all went, swam, and they saved the guy, and they pulled the. I love that story. I love that story. There's a lot of human element, you know.
That is amazing.
So obviously there were a ton of crashes that happened over this time frame in the Bahamas. And I like to think there maybe wasn't an NTSB at this point. So I'm kind of wondering, what were the majority of these crashes? You know, were they like engine failures? Was this something that could have been fixed or prevented? Or was this pilot error? Or what was this?
The typical accident was with more than one aircraft, either training or delivering. So you had that advantage. Almost every accident was either witnessed or heard, or, you know, there was always someone there. And then you have a huge degree of uncertainty. So put it this way, aircraft without any amphibious capability has a limit of endurance, pilot's limited or plane limit of endurance, right? So you know that son of a bitch can only stay airborne for 12 hours maximum based on the fuel they had, maximum. So if you hear it's coming, you know, you hear from them after 6 hours flight, you know they only have whatever, six more hours. And at that speed, you know the maximum. But here's the one that is really interesting. Seaplanes. When they go missing and blow up and crash, they could, in theory, remain adrift for many months. They have enough, they can make water out of the condensers. In theory, if they landed on the water, they could survive, right? 8, 12, 18 people. So you got to keep looking at them for many weeks. In one instance, a Uruguayan ship found these poor souls adrift in a seaplane and hoisted them onto the deck, the entire airplane, and started sailing for Uruguay. Well, the British government didn't think this was very funny at all because, you know, that was their secret airplane design. So they're like, get your asses back here and give us back our plane and our pilots. And they're like, we'll give you the pilots, but we're going to keep the plane. And the Navy was sent and intercepted. A lot of training accidents at night. So I would say the three main categories would be navigational error, a lot of young pilots from the East Coast of Florida, and you have a lot of Bermuda Triangle mysteries associated with that Flight 19. And then second would be mechanical failure. The ones I studied mostly were like fuel related or things of that nature, inability to feather a broken engine, something like that. And then you have the catastrophic, where either there's an ignition point because of fuel or a lightning strike where the whole thing just blows up. And that wasn't too uncommon. Almost always the pilot showed exemplary courage. One case I like where pilot said to the co-pilot, Murray, he said, hey, Murray, engine's gone. We're going to have to ditch. We've been circling around. He said, tell you what, I studied survivability and it's not very good for the navigator. For me and the guy in the back, we're going to be okay. So what I suggest, pop the hatch and get the hell out of here and parachute. And Murray said, I'm not going to do it. I'm staying with you guys. Whatever his reasons, he didn't want to eject alone. He wanted to stay. So they landed, and I found the plane, by the way. He landed on a lake. It turned out to be a sort of salt. And sure enough, after it coasted for like 150 feet, boom, the front wheel digs in and the plane stops. And this poor guy gets jettisoned through the plexiglass and gets pretty badly injured, and then lies on his back on the mud flat, and the plane rolls over him and pins him under the wheel. So this is really bad. So the pilot and the co-pilot hop out and they lift the airplane off their buddy, and he squeezes out and he survives. And then the aircraft patrol boat, whatever, comes by the next day and saves him. So I would say slow burn mechanical fault immediate explosive fault, or the third would be pilot error, navigational error. And if they're not found in the lifeboats always deployed. And they had a flotilla of small boats around the Bahamas so they could find the lifeboats. But almost always the lifeboats were found empty. It's a tough thing to survive, but a lot of the pilots would order the younger guys out of the bomb bay and then would try to land the plane themselves. And sometimes they were united. You have a lot of happy stories. And a lot of the time the pilot would die, saving his comrades, something like that.
So, most of us would have pretty much a basic or lay understanding of World War II. How does this search and how has this search for planes contributed to your understanding and given you a better understanding of what happened in World War II? How has that contributed? What have your learnings been?
It's a good question. I mean, the main thing is that even a tiny country like Bahamas, that population 300,000 now, was I think 200 at best, in 1940. A tiny country like that, it had a big influence as a kind of a hinge for activity, it didn't create the planes. It didn't grow these English boys. It didn't, but it was a hinge for what America had and Europe wanted. And unlike Bermuda and other countries I studied, the Bahamas was big enough with all these different sort of air bases and facilities. And the other thing that I find very moving is that until this study, I had no idea that I would talk to guys in Australia like Bob Livingston in Queensland who did the movie Unbroken. He was the airplane consultant. I spoke this yesterday for the first time. I heard of Alex Zupikov. He's from Czechoslovakia. His father was a pilot there. So I want to illustrate it with one vignette. There's a photo I found on Facebook and Ancestry of a young man who, I shouldn't maybe say this, but he looked exactly like I did at his age. And I've always been moved to him, and I dedicated the book to him. Now, his name is Cleary. So I wrote Alistair Cleary, and I wrote to every goddamn Cleary I could find in New Zealand. Now, it turns out I met a boat in Bahamas, which I then sailed to New Zealand at age 23, and I spent 6 or so months, May to November, hitchhiking and shearing sheep and selling snowboards in New Zealand. I love New Zealand. I spent 4 months on South Island, Stewart Island, writing a book, right? I love New Zealand. And I wrote every son of a gun with the name Cleary in New Zealand. And together they all started answering. It turned out that Alistair was related to different members of the family that didn't even know they were related to each other. So
wow.
My research brought them together. They found cousins they didn't know were their cousins, you see? It's so cool. And now I'm donating it to the New Zealand Military Museum, the book. And so you see, Rhodesia, I didn't know that planes left Bahamas and went to like Durban. I mean, what the hell are you doing in Durban? It's amazing. Khartoum, the siege of Khartoum, Kirchner. And Khartoum, while I was writing the book, Khartoum fell. I think Sudan had a revolution and they were going to, and we used to bring oil there. The point is, it all ties together. If you had told me that there were Rhodesian soldiers from Zimbabwe, now it's Zimbabwe, right? From Harare, wherever, I wouldn't have believed it, there's a huge section in the Australian Imperial War Museum, which, by the way, is probably one of the best war museums in the world. They have every single newspaper produced on the RAF base in Bahamas.
Really?
Every single one. And the guy that became a leader of the Bahamas independence movement, Arthur Hanna, he was a young boy editing that paper. So they had choirs, rugby, nurses. There was a guy studying venereal diseases there. They had a Navy component, a post office. They were a huge base, they had conscripts from Bahamas. It was really cool. It's quite a story.
So obviously we have to hear one of these discoveries. So can you give us kind of the 6-minute play from knowing that there's a plane, doing your research, to activating the community, to finding such plane?
Sure. And I'm going to pivot just a bit because while looking for World War II airplanes, I guess somebody realized I had earned my stripes. And they unearthed a case which had been bothering them for a decade, but which they didn't know who to entrust to take over the case. So the preeminent aviation historian of the Bahamas, yes, there is one, Paul Arana, who had his own airline. And so he entrusted me to this case. And there was a guy named Rod Radutsky in California, Norwalk, California. And he was a radio nut. So what happened was, while looking for World War II airplanes, I was asked to solve the riddle. Follow this. A Wright brothers built engine that was the first ever aircraft to land in Bermuda, right? And a few months after the Bermuda landing, they crashed in the Bahamas. It's called the Pilot Radio. And it was financed by some industrial families from Lawrence, Massachusetts, and also from Brooklyn, who were Jewish. And the whole thing was so fascinating. I was like, wow. And the navigator was a lifetime cripple. He got polio and couldn't walk his entire adult life. So he was short and crippled and couldn't walk, and yet he did. So I'll walk you through the facts. 1930, a lot of people were trying to fly to Bermuda, and there was a rumor that the Bermudian government would give $1,000 reward. So these guys left New York, and they landed on the ocean because they ran out of fuel. I've done 33 Bermuda voyages on yachts. You'd be landing on that water and taking off again alive is very unlikely, particularly at night. But they did it. They slept on the boat, and they got lost, and so people were giving them up for dead. The next day, they took off and they landed inside the reef of Bermuda. And this time they really were like completely out of fuel. And so they anchored and they waited. And some boats came out and gave them fuel. They flew into the Hamilton Harbor. And during the next week, the government arrested them and was going to like punish them. And then they found out, like, you got to think the steamship companies were pissed, and they didn't offer a reward. They were going to have $1,000 fine. But when they realized they could turn it to their advantage, they made them heroes. The local guys on the airplane, the plane was so badly damaged that they donated a couple propellers to rich Bermudians. And then they sent the plane to New York on a ship. Fast forward, they did a 50,000, some crazy, huge tour of South America. A huge, many, many months, many, many thousands of miles. The problem was that by the time it came September of 1930, and they had landed in Bermuda Bay, plane was in crap condition. So they left Dominican Republic. They had just been destroyed by a hurricane. They went over Cuba and Haiti, and they turned north through Bahamas. They were only, honestly, Farah and Merrill, they were only an hour or two from America, where they would be celebrated as, it was a hugely competitive race. And they had all these like souvenirs and films and cameras and blah, blah, blah. And what happened? The strut on the engine failed. The plane kind of had to crash. And they described in great detail how they crashed on a beach at the base of a hill, blah, 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 in the Bahamas. So fast forward, I get given the account about 2 years ago. And I start doing a paper research and a map research. And I'm thinking outside the box, and I'm thinking it's in a certain area. So I got really cocky and I bought a one-night ticket because I thought I found the plane using Google Earth. And I flew down to the Bahamas, and I was so proud of myself. I hired a guide who ended up getting stoned out of his gourd, and then me being no use. And then I had like a Jeep, and I found like nothing. So I'm up to my waist in mud where the plane's supposed to be and holding my phone. It was a total wash, and I was disappointed. I dove 4 times looking for that plane in the next year. So I went back on a yacht about 6 months later, and I, after countless hours, 4 days, very badly cut up, hitchhiking, going to strange neighborhoods, just weird stuff, I finally found a piece of melted aluminum and copper wiring and all this stuff. It was an innovative radio thing. So I sent those to California for analysis. It's not conclusive yet because I don't know anything about radios and stuff, but I did find metal that was in the right spot, and it was consistent with that aircraft. Now, think about that. If I can prove it, and God knows I want to go back with a couple other young people, unlike me, because I found myself crossing rivers and stuff that I was quite scared. I was like 8 hours alone hiking. I was dehydrated. I don't like it. I'd much rather have company, and those things. So I think I can go back with my son, find the aircraft, and find a Wright Brothers built engine. It was a Stinson 1928 built aircraft, pilot radio. Really, really cool story. So sometimes you have to be willing to leave World War II thing and pivot a bit, because a Wright Brother airplane that set the Bermuda record only happens once. And the dream is to bring the engine block, which I interviewed 5 people who said they physically stood on that engine and that plane, bring the engine block and insert the propeller from Bermuda. Remember? They gave the propeller in Bermuda. So if I can match the engine with the propeller, how cool would that be? That would be so cool.
That'd be amazing. My God. Well, I mean, you've touched on so many interesting things, like the dangers that you've faced. Tell us more about it. I mean, I'm really intrigued. So for somebody who'd be listening to you right now and would think, oh my God, I really want to do this. Talk me through some of the dangers. Tell us what the dangers or risks are involved in this type of underwater archaeology. I mean, you're making it sound very easy here. But I'm guessing walking through like yay-high mud and crossing rivers is not everyone's cup of tea.
I think being a little eccentric is a big part of it. But honestly, the main component is thorough paper research. Like you research the hell out of it. Like you really know it dead. You know everything there is to know about on a computer and interviews. You get that first. The second component, because none of us are local anywhere but the town we live or lived in. So you have to ask the locals, preferably the older locals. I was a boy that explored every inch of the woods behind our house. You can tell when you get to terrain whether people have combed it over. In this site, I found an American Geological Survey in 1938, and the plane crashed in 1930. So they would have found it, right? So I need to find their records. So another thing, to answer your question, a lot of it has to do with mentality. And I took all those tests where they said I had the fighter pilot mentality, which is very focused. You're very mission focused, and you're blind to many things, including perhaps empathy or even sympathy for yourself. You're willing to get cut up and beat up in order to achieve something, right? But one of the dangers, I always carry a whistle, which ironically I'm not carrying at the moment because I was knocked over and you blow a whistle. But what upsets people about my personality is that I'll ask for advice, I'll take their counsel, and I'll be polite about it, and then I'll completely ignore it and go the other direction. Like, what? There he goes.
Out the window.
Thanks for telling me to go right. No, I'm going over here. So I always politely ask, I always write the town fathers and is someone willing to come with me? And then they don't meet my standards of commitment, so I just go and do it without them.
What is that, Eric? Is that a gut instinct that you're relying on? Would you say there's a gut instinct there that we're not? Do you feel that you have to be quite instinctive and so impetuous in some ways, almost impulsive, like you have to just go with it and go with your gut? Sometimes no amount of research can take away gut instinct, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's informed gut instinct. I don't think I have any particular gift. I think I'm just very stubborn. And when we were growing up as kids, my dad was always making forts and making bridges and cutting things in the woods. And he was always kind of bleeding and always, and he seemed impervious to it. And that's kind of, my skin is pockmarked with injuries, tick bites and cuts and scratch. But none of it, fortunately, touch wood, I've never had a serious injury.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, it has to be honest, as a traveler, you either have time or money. Rarely do you have both. Even the guys with tons of money, they often kind of hire someone else to do a lot of the prelim because they're busy making money. So I have a very small budget, but I have quite a bit of time compared to most. I had a month to find the first plane. So that gives me a certain amount of freedom, but because I'm also just visiting Bahamas for a few days, it also increases the pressure, if that helps. So knowing when to stop is one of the most critical things. When you realize this is too dangerous, but I can't afford a scuba tank. So I'm out there putzing around, with I had a cooler. So 2 weeks ago, this is a true story. 2 weeks ago, I swam 2 miles roughly from shore to an island, Balmoral Island. And then when I was there, I was getting very tired, and I had a cooler, which had my, just some basic stuff. A red cooler with a white lid, and I had tied it on a string around my waist so nobody would run me over. Well, I noticed this really weird thing out on the reef, which when he approached me on my swim back from the island, it turned out, what a Scooby do or scuba do? It's a jet ski. You know what a jet ski?
Yeah, a sea-doo?
Yeah, a sea-doo. An old fisherman had built up fiberglass walls around a sea-doo and turned it into a small fishing boat and added an engine with,
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
And so he putts over to me and he's like, you look like you need some help. I'm like, well, not really. And he goes, oh, I've seen that airplane you're looking for. I remember it as a child. And he said, you really seem like you need some help. And I said, actually, yes, I could do some help. So typical Bahamas, he threw me a line and that was help. So he would tow me, right? So he would tow me back to the shore. It's about a mile. So I'm putting around and I'm getting towed. My hand's getting tired. And I don't want to let go unless it's really serious. I only let go once when I really thought of playing. You would not believe the people that stopped. Every boat within a mile had to go to our rescue, right? Because what you had this sort of old Rasta guy with a ski-doo it made like a Boston whaler with an engine. And behind that was like nothing. And then you see this sort of blonde-haired snorkel, right? And then about 100 feet behind that, you see a red cooler, and that's how I kind of, and they're like, what the hell is that? So they came up to me and they're like, are you okay? Are you being kidnapped?
Oh my God.
Like, what's happening? Like, what's the cooler for? And I gave the guy my snorkel, a mask. I had one in the cooler. So that was a way to thank him, So you have to kind of wing it. I probably do take too many risks given that I'm a father and that there's no monetary reward. I can't stand being told no. And please understand, people might be like, I think you might be trespassing. And I'd like to settle that for the record. There's no think about it. Like most of the time, I am.
You are absolutely.
Like, there's no ambiguity about it. I'm like, if you're on a railway, you're trespassing.
Yeah.
That's a fact. So New England's a lot more easy because I have a son and a girlfriend, and by searching for planes in New England, not to change topics directly, but there's 1,300 World War II airplane wrecks in New England. 1,300. So you're never more than 10 miles from a World War II airplane wreck in New England. So I bought this Jeep type thing, and I can go around and just find them. And this is my technique. Do you want to know the technique?
Yeah, please.
It's a lot less dangerous, right? So after World War II, there were a lot of men died. 3% of humankind was killed. And a lot of them, civilian women, men, children, but a lot of them were men. So there was a gap in the demographic globally for men 18 to 25. That's obvious. So some women that were very keen after the war to meet men found it challenging, right? So one of the advice and this could be fictional, I don't know, but one advice was wear a sundress, go to a downtown area and look vulnerable.
Oh my gosh.
Like carry a map, and like guys will swarm to you to mansplain and all that stuff. So it's a horrible thing. I hope it's a joke, but this was my technique. I would go in my Jeep to a field near where a plane crashed, and I know what the hell I was doing, but I would hold like maps upside down and be like, and I always wear an Oxford shirt when I'm in the field because like people assume you're educated. Like I always wear a really nice Oxford shirt because they're like, oh, he must be like a professor, or he's probably.
How insane. Oh my God.
I stand out in the field and I like hold it upside down. I just stand there for like 10, 15 minutes. I know what the hell I'm doing, but I'm like, I play dumb. I play vulnerable. Like
it works.
And almost always some old farmer's like, well, son, you look kind of lost there. Let me tell you about the
I love it. I love it.
I'm like, please mansplain, please tell me, and they're like, yeah, I saw that plane crash. It's happened so many. One of my favorite, I shouldn't share this, but they're like, oh yeah, I know that airplane. It was in Cummington, Massachusetts. Cummington, it would have fantastic name. So I bought cheese from the cheese. I got closer and closer to the farmer where it crashed, right? He goes, oh yeah, I remember that one. My brother and I, we took all the bullets and the machine guns, and they had boxes of them. And we took them and we hit them up in the Sheffield, Farmer Sheffield's barn. I'm like, Farmer Sheffield's barn? Where's that? Oh, it's easy. It collapsed. It's over on like Harrow Road. Yeah, Farmer Emmington's barn. So I'm like, okay, thank you. I got my car. I went to Harrow Road and I looked for the only collapsed barn. I pulled the car over. I walked in. I pulled a couple ammo boxes out. Bob's your uncle. Take some pictures. The thing was collapsed.
Amazing. Oh my God.
Ahoy, investors! Are you on the lookout for a unique opportunity to invest in a thriving industry? Set your sights on ShipShape, the innovative platform connecting boat and yacht owners with top-notch marine service providers. Our team is committed to revolutionizing the marine repair and refit market in North America. But we can't sail these seas alone. With your support, we can enhance our platform and create a significant impact in the industry. Don't let this exciting investment opportunity drift away. Contact us today to learn more about joining our voyage. Reach out to us at info@shipshape.pro.
Your work involves a great deal of detective work and also kind of a physical showing up and finding these things. And so what's the combination of that? How has that enriched your life?
Part of it is standing. I say it's like standing like a sundial. And you pretend you were Farah when her plane crashed, or Meryl, and you're like, what would Meryl have done? Or if the person died, like what's the last thing they saw? Or yesterday I was studying I was on a river, Sudbury River, and I learned from watching a video of an oral history like this, that the guy said the planes didn't just collide. They then, as they fell, they collided a second time. So one guy died, Smith, on the railway tracks. The other guy survived, Munson. So the fact that the planes hit each other twice told me that they were probably pretty damn close to each other. And then the fact that Munson walked out of the woods 300 yards to the tracks, now you know, like the kind of terrain. He didn't swim, the words they use, it wasn't a swamp, it wasn't a lake, So I like to think of the people, that what they were doing and what they were thinking. One of the things that saddened me, I was in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and the guy was extremely helpful. He told me where the plane crashed along the railway. There are quite a lot of homeless people in America along railway tracks, as you know. So I have to be a little careful. There's also hunters and bow and arrow. There's a lot of ways to get hurt. Farah, the other day I found a bear trap in a field, and that really it scared me because I didn't know what a bear trap is. But bears are big and mean, and like if I got in a bear trap, like what the hell am I going to do?
Exactly. I lose half a leg.
I don't even know where I am. So like I call on the cell phone. I'm like, I'm in a field. I got a bear trap, like it's horrifying to me that and there's wild boar, wild pig. But getting back to the story of Haverhill, and I don't mean to disparage anyone, but they say, oh yeah, we made plaques for most of the guys who died. But you see, this guy was screwing around and he was doing whirly whirls, whatever, mock fighter pilot fighting, they felt he was showing off. And what he didn't realize is like, that was his order. If you're going to go up against a hardened Luftwaffe veteran or Imperial Japanese Air Force veteran, who's been shooting down planes for 5 years, you better know what you're doing. You better try combat techniques, right? They're like, oh no, we didn't want to leave a plaque for him because he was like just screwing around and showing off. Well, he wasn't screwing around. He was trying to fight Japanese and Germans, it's not his fault that the plane crashed, I mean, another genre is the boys who showed off on their homes on their way to Europe. They would buzz their family homes. Well, if they did it once and then kept flying, like that would normally be okay. But a lot of them kept trying for a bigger high and like circling back until they crashed. And you can just imagine how gut-wrenching that would be to the families that they knew it was their son and they knew why he was there. They're kind of like, in one case, there is a case in Presque Isle Airport up in Rostock, Maine, right? And they were potato farmers, and it was the fall, and he was going over to Europe. And he buzzed enough times. It was the second time he'd done it. He got punished the first time. And they were just really basic, poor, rural, like, environment, I guess, because it was like a lot of people from many ages, from age 11 up to like 80, and they were pulling potatoes using horse-drawn carts, like wooden carts. And so what happened was, after about 20 minutes of this bullshit, Mr. Freeman, who had 2 children there, he's like, they knew who it was. They knew the pie. He lived it. He was from that farm, the Anderson farm. And he said, guys, kids, get in my cart because we're getting the hell out of here. This isn't going to end well. We're out of here. I'm ordering you. Get in the cart. We're going to the woods. And they jumped in and he hightailed it on that horse. And sure enough, the airplane hit the carts and everyone on the plane tumbled forward. Everyone died. Everyone on the carts died. All the horses died. I mean, it was the worst, bloodiest, civilian type accident that you could have. I think he killed like 8 people on the ground and 8 people on the plane. So people do really stupid things too. Now in Bahamas, none of them had family. But it's quite sobering that how much of a part the human element plays. And then there's the inhuman ones where they're descending from clouds and they hit a mountain and they don't have any time. They just don't have any time to react, But in Bahamas, there are no mountains. The sad thing for me in the Bahamas is the long time waiting and drifting. Like if they survive the initial crash, there was one, they landed on a reef at night and the men were asking where their buddy was. There were only 4 of them. And 2 of the crew went back and pulled their buddy out as the plane was sinking, which is very, very brave. And then I met these old couple who were bouncing up and down on the wings as kids. And there's one other social factor. Like I go around the Bahamas and I'm like, hi, I'm a historian. Can I talk to your grandmother? They're like, sure, come on in. If I did that in America, and especially say if I was black in a white neighborhood, they wouldn't say that. They might be mean. They might chase me off. I'm very lucky because the Bahamas has been very friendly and
receptive.
Yeah, it must be that Oxford shirt that you wear.
Yeah, and the damsel in distress fake look.
Yeah, exactly. Just hold the map upside down. Gee,
I'm going to use the strategy now. I'm going to pretend and use the strategy. Tell me, Eric, one thing that's just sort of triggered, you're talking about these stories. I just want to ask, how can you ensure that the information you're extracting from these sites is reliable, the authenticity, given there's so many conflicting stories from World War II? You don't know if everything is accurate. Some of it's hearsay. Some of it's, as you said, spread through generations. You go, you meet people, someone's grandmother says she saw something. How can you ensure the authenticity of the information that you're getting? How do you know it's reliable, and how do you piece it together?
Almost every bit of information is flawed. Probably a third of it's flawed somewhere. But I learned once from the absence. I asked a guy, what was it like? 40 sailors walked into your village. He said, what 40 sailors? Oh, shit. They didn't come here, because he was a teenager. He would have noticed. But to answer your question, and the answer is so simple. The artifact, the item, most people aren't sure what my motive is. My motive is to find a piece of metal like that and take a picture of it. If I can positively identify, airplanes are very, very unique. They're made out of light material. The strongest, most durable parts are the oleo legs, which are have these stainless steel pistons, and then the bomb release, which are also stainless steel. And then obviously, of course, the engines. The engines are massive amalgams of steel and metal. But the most people don't realize that the rubber and the stainless steel of the legs are, because if the plane doesn't absorb all that impact and landing, then the plane will be destroyed. So they invest a huge amount of money in the legs of the airplane. So if I can find any shred of that piece of that plane, a photo or something, that's all I want. I want to find a piece of metal that's plane-like and photograph it, which in a way isn't that selfish, right? I'm not trying to rebuild the plane. Yeah. For me, finding a piece of the airplane is the ending of my participation in the story physically, except then I go home and I share the photos in a book form. So the reason that I look for the part of the plane is to prove what people told me was right, and also to prove what was wrong. And I mentioned in other podcasts that I can't stand propaganda. I can't stand people believing, they want to believe. I don't like unfair treatment. And let me clarify. I get a lot of calls from people asking about Flight 19, which was I don't know, 6 or 9 planes that went missing after the war. And it really irks me for a number of reasons. It wasn't in the Bahamas. It wasn't during the war. And all reports I've heard were that the leaders of that expedition were either drunk or drunk or in some stage of drunkenness, right? And so I just have no interest in it. It's not relevant, But what pisses me off is that those 19, whatever it is, Flight 19, however many men died, and God bless their soul, whatever the rest. But I have 170 men who died in the Bahamas, right? On 170 planes, and nobody gives a shit about it. So that's my job. Let me tell you about the New Zealand guy named Adrian Cleary, who died in my country. Nobody knows anything about this guy, nothing. And they don't give a shit. And if I didn't find out, nobody would know about it. So let me do a clumsy job of finding Adrian, and then somebody can do a better job, right? So I publish an article every 2 weeks in the Bahamas paper, hoping that people outsmart me, hoping I give them everything that I know in a news column, so that they can take what I learn and apply it to their village or their island or their city. A guy told me, Eric, my dad and mom ran to that aircraft in 19 whatever, and they both were looking at the wrecked plane, which I went to a couple weeks ago, and they didn't meet each other. Later on, they met each other. He became the Secretary of Finance of the whole Bahamas, signed every dollar bill, Bill Allen and his wife. And because of my article, they realized they both had gone to the same wreck at the same age, 7 and 10, and they hadn't met. And then they ended up meeting, years later, marrying, becoming one of the leading lights of the Bahamas, having 6 children, whichever, So that to me is meaningful, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not an important part of the story, except that I'm so stubborn. My real skill isn't that I can find planes or write books or do the research. That's not really the scope, because I get a shitload of help for all of that. The field research, I'll take some credit for, because once I'm in the field, I'm so stubborn, I just go off on my own. But the real skill is convincing other people to give a shit. Convincing other people to care about Cleary, to care about the plane in Bannermantown, to care about anything, the RAF graves in Nassau, any of it, right?
That's the hardest part. That is the hardest part, not the research, not the information, not the gleaning information.
That's my skill, is getting other people to buy in to some esoteric, obtuse aspect of our history, right? And somebody said to me, Eric, you may become a venerated aviation historian. No, I won't. In 2 years, I'll be writing about butterflies. And 4 years I'll be writing about goddamn bicycles, and then I'll be, who knows what I'll be writing? Elephants, I don't know. I'm like very distracted. I mean, 4 years ago I was writing about U-boats and I couldn't find them. So I switched to airplanes, but my hope is to interest other people. You see, don't be like me. Don't try this at home,
And one discovery that you had was an unopened whiskey, right? Or scotch. Can you tell the story on that?
I hadn't found the plane yet. And then I found that scotch. And you find a lot of bottles, like many. And most of the time you ignore them, Heineken, whatever. But I took it home and I kind of looked at it. And I'm like, in my country, nobody throws away a bottle of scotch with the lid still on and the cork still in it, like it still had the cork. I'm like, whoever threw that bottle in the ocean, wasn't Bahamian. Because we're a proud nation of drinkers, So, and also the prohibition brought more income to us until the drug trade. So I knew something was amiss when you find and it was a Scottish built, it's actually a cafe, internet cafe in Glasgow is the site of this Blom's whiskey distillery or whatever. You can go in there and tap on the computer or whatever in an internet cafe. But so that gave me a clue. And then I dug deeper and I bought the memoirs. There's a book called The Transatlantic Bridge. And it's about the guys. And that's where I learned from the Americans mostly about the jocularity of hiding all the bottles in the front because nobody inspected the front because you didn't have the machine guns armed in the front when you were just transporting it, right? You put those in to kill people. So it's just bad aerodynamics. So unfortunately, it must have been a game. But if somebody didn't tell the pilot that there were shitloads of whiskey in the front, then that's going to affect your stability. We've all been on planes where they ask to move you around. So what happened was that unopened bottle keyed me off that this was almost certainly a B-26 that was being flown to Africa, and the whiskey was going to be sold in Asuncion. And Bahamas had any amount of whiskey, any age, it was a very booming business. And so it made total sense. And remember, the planes only went one direction, for the British, and that was east. They never went back to America. What I mean by that is they're not likely to get in trouble. The further you went, the more lax, I guess. But the sad thing is that could affect, the airplane's mobility. And those guys would have lived probably, but there was a hurricane building and they landed on the water thinking it would be smooth, but the waves were there, but the wind wasn't. So I kind of feel bad for them. And a nurse witnessed them. I'm going to see the nephew of that unopened bottle airplane. I'm going to go see, her uncle died. And so her name's Joanne Green. And I'm going to drive to Canada in 2 weeks. I'm going to speak at the B-26 Marauder Historical Society. And I'm very excited. And I'm the keynote speaker that night. And then I'm going to drive to Ontario and meet with her.
And where is this bottle?
Yeah, that was my next question, actually, Merrill. Thank you. Yeah. Where is this bottle?
Everything's very well photographed. The bottle has been given to Dr. Grace Turner, PhD, at the Antiquities, Monuments, and Museums Corporation of the Bahamas, which is the National Museum of the Bahamas. And it is, I put the cork, carefully labeled, it's all very carefully
not open.
And she happens to be a bottle collector. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so she's a bottle collector. So she understood the significance. And I found some old pirate bottles and stuff. This is where the scuba do or whatever, the Scudoo, there's the same area. So she has it in the National Museum. And so it's quite an exciting, I feel that it's definitely well, taken care of. One of the next aspects is, the National Airport of the Bahamas is where they did all the training, and it's still very, very active. And I've gone back there, and there's two things I have to admit. Like my family send their kids to school in the Bahamas, and I'm walking around on a Monday morning, in the bush along the road, and everyone's looking at me, and I'm a little embarrassed. And so it's a very small community. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get a police escort or some volunteers, and we'll go along the runway, in the bush, because that's where most of the accidents happen. And it's going to take a few days, but the idea until we find some metal or something like that. I've tried it at the airports that's closed, but it's right near the college and university. And apparently it's a big smooching spot.
Oh.
And the thing about smooching is they go in their cars. So you can choose a slot where there's a long distance with no cars and you go in the woods, but when you pop out, now there's like 3 smooching cars. And so like if you pop out of the woods, like there are going to be guys there, coitus interruptus, who are not happy. So
they're
then,
like, oh my God.
So I try to avoid the cars, but it can take hours to like get away from the smoochers, So
And they're like, oh my God, it's the Zodiac.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Apparently it's college kids making a couple extra bucks. How can you be revenge?
So, Eric, as we kind of come to our conclusion, you've written all of this into a book. Can you tell us about the book? Tell us where people can find it?
Yes, please.
Sure, thanks. It's Island Books, which is my publishing house. It's my 34th book from that brand. And so that book is everywhere available: New Zealand, Korea, Japan, India, anywhere in the world, through the Ingram and Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all that. It's 310 pages. It's color illustrated with about 300 illustrations. And I wrote it. All my books I finish here at this club. It's like my little peaceful routine. There was a movie done about that. Stephen King had a movie about the fan who like breaks his legs, and he always had his routine. Hasn't happened to me because I'm not famous enough. But anyway, so it's at the New York Post for consideration to be like endorsed. I actually paid a full-time, proper professional copy editor, because one of my problems was I rushed these books. I wrote it in 8 weeks, and then I add the illustrations, and readers get frustrated, as would I, to find errors. And the problem with my books, there's so many obtuse words, but this editor did a great job. So hopefully it'll move. I'm already begun Warplanes Lost and Found in New England, and I'm meeting with the 2 biggest gurus. I had a meeting with them recently but I got a tick bite and I couldn't get out of bed.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So there's always like bear traps, snakes, tick bites. I mean, you never know, right? But
I'll plan my holiday to you quite carefully, Eric. I'll make sure that
yes,
there's no mud, there's no sludge, and there's no tick bites anywhere near it.
Oh, I was in life. By the way, you can do this all over the world. So 2 things. I was in a wedding in Sweden, and I had a couple hours free time, and it's so crazy. It's like 5 Messerschmitts landed within a couple miles of my hotel. So I'm like, what the hell's going on? So I go to the websites and they tell me that what happened was the morning that the Soviets took over a Latvian airbase. And I love it when people cut through the BS, right? So it's like dawn. The Soviets are like an hour away. And the commander of this base, he's like, all right, everybody, if you stick around for a couple hours, you are going to be prison bait and you're never going to get out of the Soviet Union. So what I recommend, fire up the planes that work. The pilots take as many living bodies of Germans as they can, and go west until you run out of fuel. That is my order. Take off, go west, land when you run out of fuel. So they all ran out of fuel near this village I was staying in Sweden. So you had 5 Messerschmitts that landed within 10 miles, and they all pretty much lived. And one when they asked to be imprisoned rather than go to Germany, and several married Swedish women. Go figure. So you really don't know what you're going to find. And then in England, I went to find the Lyford Chapel, which is west of London. It's near Wongate. You never heard of it, nor did I. Anyway, and then what happened? A bomber landed right in the field in front of the church with 7 guys, and they all died. But so I was looking at the church named after the school that I went to, and then there was this bomber. So the message of my babbling today is that history really is everywhere, and that it is often really obvious. We just haven't dug around. And with the internet, there's no reason not to, really, So no one would ever get bored trying to find cool stuff in their backyard. Last image. When I met the farmer who mansplained, he drove me to an Army veteran behind whose house the plane had crashed. And I opened my trunk and I got my real work clothes out, which is all like barbor, And then as I put my mosquito repellent and the whistle and all that crap, very focused with my torch and my cutlass. And I went in the woods. The guy saluted me. I'd never been in the military. He saluted me, and that was very, very special. I never told anyone in my life that I've been in the military, but he honored what I was doing. I was going alone somewhere I didn't know shit about for many hours. And this is what I did. And he liked it. So that to me is better than selling a bunch of books.
What do we expect in the future from Eric?
Prison Block 9 for no.
More tick bites.
I just wrote a children's book, 15 pages, and it's about dealing with PTSD and celebrating life. And hopefully I'm getting it illustrated. And so, I just applied to a reputable university to be a writer for their magazine. So I just continued output of writing, and if it doesn't make me cry, I don't want to write about it further. So, I want to make people cry all around the world.
Awesome, Eric. Well, thank you for coming on to the show.
Yes, thank you, Meryl, and thank you, Farah.
It's been a pleasure again.
Thank you.
Check back every Tuesday for our latest episode. And be sure to like, share, and subscribe to shipshape.pro.